Well, first off, thank you all for being here on Monday morning. Did you notice it's Monday morning? Okay, I just want to make sure you're there. That's pretty good. I think it just shows how brave I am that I'd be willing to speak to a high school group on the first class on Monday morning. That's high risk. So I was really lucky to get to work with refugees. I did not have what would be called in any way a classic humanitarian background. Many of the people who work with refugees come out of what's the non-governmental or the NGO world, the non-governmental organization world. They work for Save the Children, CARE, for somewhere usually in the field. I had come really much more out of Maine, and I've been involved with politics. But when I got to work for the Clinton administration in Washington, I had a chance to start a new office that dealt with countries in transition. And the international development community has never done a very good job with political change. They do more economic development. It's dominated by economists, that industry. And so I came from a different background, and I was asked to deal with political change, and there happened to be a lot of political change in the 1990s. There were lots of small wars all over the place. So it was a little bit like being involved in the internet industry, or the computer industry. If you were born before 1955, you worked for IBM. If you were born after 1959, you worked for many of the names of the people that you know around Seattle. So all those guys were born in 56, 57, 58, and that's almost a dividing line. Well, in my business, if you were working sort of international crises and wars in the 1990s, it was a golden era because there were so many things going on. Haiti, Bosnia, Rwanda, and many of the places you've studied, they were all kind of unraveling at the same time because of the Iron Curtain had crashed. And so I was very lucky to get to start a new office. It did some exciting things, and it caught the attention of some people in the U.S. government because it was new and it was different. But it also caught the attention of the woman who became my boss at the High Commissioner for Refugees, Sadako Ogata, who was a Japanese diplomat. And she wanted somebody who had dealt with rapid political change because she felt that the humanitarians were getting stuck in countries, sort of the way the military thinks they did get stuck in countries. In Bosnia, the humanitarians couldn't get out because we didn't resolve the political conflict. So the humanitarians were the only people that were there, and then the humanitarians ended up doing everything. So it was that combination of things that got me selected to be the Deputy High Commissioner, which was it was a kind of a big jump. I got to go from sort of the minor leagues to a big time job in a bit of a surprising way, but mostly because Sadako Ogata wanted somebody who understood politics and political change. And that was what she hoped to be able to bring to the humanitarian world, which she thought was stuck. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Anytime I don't answer your question, please feel free to, or if it generates a related question, just give me two fingers and we can digress that way if you like. So this hopefully will be a conversation. You'll see that I can give you longer answers, but if you want shorter answers, make them true or false questions or multiple choice.
Okay, so I think we're just going to jump right into this. So you said our cardinal mistake, perhaps the cardinal mistake in all this work, which we never seem to learn, is that solutions driven and imposed by outsiders never stick, especially without the input of the people we claim to help. So how have you attempted to address this idea while working at the International Line?
Did you all hear that question? How many people think that sounds true? Anybody disagree? Yeah. So, so the question part of it at the end was,
how have you intended to address this idea while working at the International Line?
so my first rule of thumb is that it's really hard to know what's going on in these places. I mean, they're complicated enough to begin with, but then when people are afraid they're going to get killed, they are less candid or forthcoming with what might be happening. So you really have to work hard, and you have to have a lot of humility. I'll just give you kind of a more down-home experience that I had. My daughter, who's a bit older than you, but when she was closer to your age, she was in the kitchen one day with 4 or 5 of her friends, and they didn't notice that I was there, so they were just talking and having a good time. But I decided, and I was hearing things that I didn't know, and so I said to them, what percentage of your life do you think your fathers understand? And they all sort of laughed, and they said, well, maybe 38%. And I said, what percentage of your lives do you think your mothers understand? And they said, well, it's probably more like 80%. So I figured if there's somebody who's living in my house, and who I see every day, and I have quite a lot of good conversations with, and I get along with well, and I only understand 38% of their lives, how much am I likely to know in a place like Rwanda or Bosnia or Afghanistan or whatnot? So I sort of came up with a rule of thumb that if you don't know at least 100 people in a place, don't send any U.S. soldiers. That seemed like a pretty reasonable response. But to get to know 100 people, it's not just the ministers of finance or the minister of defense or the generals that you're working with. It's actually knowing some people in the place. If we had adhered to that rule, we probably wouldn't be in Afghanistan today. We probably wouldn't have been in Iraq, and we could have avoided Vietnam as well. So 3 of the most difficult challenges in our history, if we had set ourselves even the simplest rule, we could have avoided. Now, how do I get to know people? Well, I love the way that journalists work in a country. That basically, it's not an academic study where I go and I meet 100 people and I ask them all the same questions, and then have the survey results, and this is much more iterative. It's much more feeds on what the last person told you, what you're starting to pick up, what you think is going on in the place. And so every meeting is essentially kind of a series of interviews, but they're iterative, built on what you've just been hearing from everybody before you. And don't be embarrassed to start with really stupid stuff. So there are interviews that I've had with people where I will have a binder. I'll have somebody with me who really knows the place, or might even be from the government. But I want to know, okay, tell me again why this war has started. And people go, well, we all, my minder might say, we all know why this war has started, because the Serbs and the Croats don't like the Bosniaks. No, I actually want to hear this person of Serbian background tell me why they think they're fighting. I want the most fundamental questions, and then I want to build on them. And I never want to be rushed. I don't want to be, this is a 15-minute interview. I want to be able to stay there as long as I can. And when you spend that kind of time with people, you don't really still know what's going on, but you're now starting to get some trend lines. And there's lots of things you can do. You can datafy what you're doing if you want to turn it into data pretty easily as well. So you can pick up a lot by just the numbers that you are exposed to and the amount of time you spend with people. And don't be in a rush. Most of us are probably pretty good students. You're in a good school. So what's the reward? If somebody asks you a question, the first person who has their hand up against an answer, that's a reward, right? Isn't that pretty much our system of being the smartest in the class? In this case, I don't want people to raise their hand and have the answer right away. I don't want somebody to tell me, I've talked to 3 people and now I know what's going on in the place. I want a forced humility, and you really have to force it upon yourselves, because after you've talked to somebody who's very convincing, guess what you think? I think I now know what's going on here. And so you can't be in a rush. You really got to let it mature, and you've got to be extremely humble in what you don't know. Now, the other thing I would say is, having written a book, I was kind of surprised at how much I didn't know as I was writing the book. So, for example, in the Rwanda chapter here, some of you get a chance to read the Rwanda chapter? I didn't know the history anywhere near as well as I thought I did. But I wanted to have kind of a little popular history in the book. And so maybe it was 4 or 5 pages of kind of looking back on the system of enslavement that the Belgians had set up. And I didn't really know that, even though I was thrown right into the middle of the post-genocide period. I didn't know as much of that as I probably should have. And so I always suggest that when you get to places that you read novels before you get there, because many times in the novels, people can say exactly what they're feeling. Whereas in a piece of nonfiction, you have to stick to the truth or what you think is acceptable or whatnot. So, but read novels, make sure you get more depth than you can get just from the contemporary scene. Did I answer that question? All right.
So what have you observed about what the United States or the United Nations have done to change the way they approach these types of situations in foreign countries with people that they don't know? Or has there been any effort to change?
Yeah, I mean, there have been efforts to change. I got to start 2 new parts of the U.S. government, which is really unusual. And it was because both the State Department, a bunch of secretaries of state thought that the State Department does too much reporting and doesn't have the ability to take action. And at AID, the Agency for International Development, the feeling was that they don't do political stuff, they just do economics, whatever. So I got to start 2 new parts of the U.S. government because there's a feeling that when it comes to crisis countries, fragile states, conflict-related places, the U.S. doesn't really have a good way to do it. I'm sorry to report that we still need quite a reluctant group. And it's one reason that there are people, when they talk about the Afghanistan war, they say that we've had 17 one-year wars. So that's because we're constantly rotating the people, we bring in new generals, we bring in new ambassadors, we bring in new, it's a hardship post. The diplomats are there for a very short time. So if you have constantly changing people and constantly changing strategies, it's going to be, and these are hard places, the likelihood of success is slim anyway. This is, in the book I describe this as venture capital. If you're successful 10% of the time, you're doing great. I was introduced a couple of weeks ago by somebody who said, and Rick's worked on all these wars, and most of these places are still at war. And I was sort of like, yeah, that's actually going to be the story. That's not, you're not able to solve it. So the U.S. tends to go in with very much the same approach. Oftentimes, it relies on the military too much. It doesn't rely on the local people enough. And it tries to set up many parallel systems as opposed to really building off of whatever the country might have to offer. So most of the examples that I offer here are things that I tried to bring American ingenuity to, but I hoped that it was built on something that was going on locally. So for example, in Nigeria, has anybody been in Nigeria? Anybody spent time in Africa? Okay. So where have you been in Africa? You've been to Kenya?
Ethiopia.
You were worked in Kenya, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And where have you been? What countries have you been to in Africa?
Morocco.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Morocco, Egypt.
Morocco and what? You speak up a bit?
Morocco, Egypt, Tanzania. and-
Tanzania?
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got sub-Saharan Africa as well. Good. And where have you been?
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia. Uh-huh. Did you live there or did you,
I was there for 2 months.
2 months?
My parents had.
So that's one of the magical stories right now, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
If you look around the world for good news,
Yeah.
this is, I mean, that's a really good news story right now. Was this sort of a row had you,
I've been to Kenya and Tanzania.
Tanzania, with school programs or
Yeah.
just on your own? Uh-huh.
South Africa.
South Africa. No, was it a few of you in the next row?
Yeah, South Africa.
South Africa as well. Was that a school program or no? Good. Great. Well, so let me, maybe instead of using a Nigerian example, let me just use a Kenyan example, since that. So Kenya had a very violent election in 2007, 2008. About 1,000 plus people got killed, and about 500,000 people had to leave their homes. Probably never to go back to their homes. Did you, those of you who know Kenya, had you heard of that? So it was all kind of election-related violence, pretty standard practice, but the old politicos who created the violence, you used to be able to turn it off. They could turn it on, but they used to be able to turn it off. And in that election, they didn't quite succeed at turning it off. And it went on for quite a while after the election. And so the country was shaken and the international community was shaken because Nairobi is sort of the center of international operations in that part of Africa. It's got a lot of the UN offices and big embassies and other things. But it's also, Kenya is really much more advanced than most of its neighbors. So it was always seen as kind of an anchor of sanity in a part of the world that was a bit less predictable. So they made a lot of changes in Kenya. They got a new constitution. They gave more power to the Supreme Court. They brought in a new chief of police. It's a national police force. They did a lot of things that they thought might prevent violence, including in the Constitution outlawing hate speech, and two of the political leaders, major political leaders, were taken to the International Tribunal for having incited the violence. So there was a lot going on in kind of the formal level. But when you talked to Kenyans, as we did when we went in there, we discovered that they were still really nervous about that election, about the coming election. Even though they'd done all these institutional changes, they still felt that the culture of the place was going to encourage political violence. And so that made them really nervous. So we had a team in there, we were trying to organize it. In fact, the guy from Seattle was part of my team. John Schroeder was part of the team in Kenya for that election cycle. And the U.S. was spending money there, but guess what the U.S. was spending about $800 million a year in Kenya. And where do you think 95% of that money was being spent? Does anybody have any idea what our programmatic focus was?
Military?
No? Fighting AIDS. So almost all the $800 million was for fighting AIDS, which was a worthy cause, but it had virtually nothing to do with this particular challenge that people were feeling in Kenya at that time. So I guess that kind of an earlier question. So I had a meeting with a group of about this size out in the Rift Valley, which is where most of the violence had been. And instead of having each program tell me why they were doing brilliant work, we had a conversation about what was going on in Kenya. And the conversation was a bit like you were asking before. It started like this. What worries you most right now in Kenya? And one woman spoke up and she said, election-related violence in the coming election. And everybody in the room went. I said, do you all agree? And we pretty much agreed. So then it was, now we're off because it was pretty easy. These were all the top grant recipients of the U.S. government in the room. So the people who were running the AIDS program, running a horticulture program, running health programs, I mean, whatever it was, they were all in the room together. And so then we said, okay, are you doing everything you would like to be doing to combat election-related violence? And they said, no. And then we said, would you like to do more? They said, yeah, we'd like to do more. Okay, what might you bring to this? And the first guy to speak up basically said, well, I run a horticulture program. I only have 400 farmers in my program, so I don't know what value that might have. So I said to him, well, I'm from the United States, and if I started with 400 farmers, I could be elected governor of any state except for Texas. And they all laughed. They actually knew what that meant. Because 400 farmers is a pretty nice little base. It's not bad to have 400 farmers. They can be a live force. So the next woman to speak was, she said, I run the AIDS program here, and we visit 220,000 households a week. How about, what value might that bring? That's a pretty dynamic organization that they're visiting 220,000. Now, so then we got to, what's the problem? The problem is, that the people who work for me right now are all busy doing the AIDS program or the horticulture program 24/7. So for me to use this asset, I'm gonna have to hire somebody else to be able to use these contacts or this model that we have to work on combating election-related violence. And to do that, all they need to do is hire 1, 2, or 3 staffers for the next 6 months. So instead of my bringing in a $200,000 a year American and putting them in there to try to figure out, they could go and immediately hire a Kenyan for about $2,000. And they could then mobilize their organization to combat election-related violence. Now, that's a pretty simple way. So for virtually no money, for $600,000, we mobilized all these groups all over the country, and then we put them in touch with the police. Because the other thing you heard in Kenya was there are no honest policemen in Kenya. And so we worked on the assumption that there was at least one honest policeman in Kenya. Seems like a good assumption, doesn't it? We didn't know which one it was, but so we were working with them everywhere. And now you connected the police to the community groups, and they each had a responsibility for early warning, for singling out election-related violence, hate speech, going to rallies where they would actually contest hate speech. So a lot was now happening, supplemented by a 5,000-person student group, by a local Pepsi distributor, by the local Catholic church and the local Episcopal church. So you suddenly had a community-wide effort that was really just being promoted by, kind of helped along by a small American contribution. So those kinds of things, I think, are always available, and we need to do more of those things if we're not going to get sucked into owning the place, because I think the United States is a very bad colonial power. We don't do colonialism. We escaped from colonialism, so why should we be a colonial force anywhere else in the world? It doesn't make sense. Okay, let's try for some shorter answers here.
So, you mentioned the warning signs that all those people had seen throughout their experiences, like all the election-related violence or other locations as well. Do you believe that atrocities like what happened in Rwanda can be prevented by the international community? Because you mentioned the U.S. mobilization there, and in Kenya, do you think that that same could work with a more international approach? Or does prevention need to come from within the country itself?
Or what's the last part?
Or does prevention need to come within the country itself?
Well, it really has to be, you really have to support it, encourage it, and protect it in the country itself, because what happens as you in any of these societies, once people start to fear violence, the amount of space that they operate in gets pretty constrained. So the international community has to be careful not to single out locals, what I call dear hearts in the book, who then become the targets of attacks because the international community thinks they're the answer for things. But I do believe that in places like Rwanda, in Kenya, by the way, what ended up happening was there was almost no election-related violence. It didn't mean that the election turned out very well. It was still kind of a dissatisfying result. But we weren't picking the candidates, we weren't doing the rest of it. But what we were able to do was to keep the violence from spreading. So I do think the international community can do a lot, but you really got to get started earlier, and you have to care more about these issues. What ends up happening is if we're doing health programs for the country, we just keep doing those things, even though all of this other noise is growing. And for example, Rwanda before the genocide was one of the world's development success stories. It was a major success story. The Chinese had built the stadium, the Chinese had done the roads, the health programs were run by the Europeans, and so actually it was a much more organized country than almost everybody around it. But it had this deep-seated political division that nobody was addressing. And I think you've always got to pay attention to the politics. And when I say politics, it's politics writ large. It's not that politics includes economics, sociology, anthropology. You know, it's the culture of a place. And we can see troubling trend lines in our country right now as well, that certain behaviors, certain kinds of hate speech, certain kinds of violence are much more broadly accepted. And anybody who thinks it can't happen wherever you are, you shouldn't kid yourselves, because I was stunned in my very first trip when I went to Sarajevo and to Bosnia. 2 hours before, I'd been sitting in Switzerland, and it was like, you know, everything was fine. The scariest thing that morning when I flew out of Zurich was that I saw a heroin addict on the street. And I was like, and then, you know, a couple hours later, you're basically running into a building, and you've got flak jackets on, and so it can be very immediate. So you really do need to pay attention to it. And so the early awareness is hugely important.
Okay, so,
You want to follow up on that?
Yeah, could you elaborate on some of those warning signs that you talked about?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the behaviors of the political class are really important, because that means they have bases of people who are supporting them. So if the political class is now performing in a way that seems like, whoa, this was our norm, and now it's out here, that's a big warning sign, because it's not like they're doing it because they're just crazy. They actually have people who agree with what they're saying. And so, for example, my very, very first trip, I went to Sarajevo, and person after person told me that they never, ever expected that they were going to be attacked by their neighbors. So, I can't believe that my neighbor attacked me. Or, I talked to a woman this week, and there's a conference in Washington. She grew up in Sarajevo. Her family was totally intermarried, so they had, and she has not talked to her Serb relatives since the mid-1990s. And she's a peace builder. So she has actually tried to talk to these people. She passes them on the street. They don't know each other. I mean, this is now 24 years later. So, I mean, those are pretty common behaviors. And then the same thing in Rwanda, people were stunned that they were singled out, or that somebody came to their school or came to their home and murdered them. So I would say those are a couple quick early warning things I